He saw her on a bridge no wider than a hallway and swore the world went silent. The island was Burano postcard-colored houses, leaning toward the canals like they were whispering secrets to the water. Late afternoon, light draped everything in gold. Tourists chased the glow with their phones. A busker, somewhere behind the lace shops, was testing the first 4 notes of a song and never committing to the 5th. And on that crooked bridge, a girl turned her head just enough that the light cut across her cheekbone, exactly like her mother's had, exactly like his daughter's should. Mateo Romano didn't remember stepping off the vaporetto. He didn't remember saying scusa as he threaded past a slow-moving couple with matching sun hats. He just remembered the sharp, exact feeling in his chest, the one he'd learned to mute for 9 years, jerking awake, like it had been waiting for the precise angle of that girl's profile to punch the code. "Alessia," he said, except he didn't say it out loud. The girl, no, young woman now, was laughing at something a friend said. She had a paper cone of fried calamari in one hand and the relieved posture of someone who finally found shade. Her hair was pulled back. Loose wisps framed her face in a way that made her look like every sketch he'd ever kept and every sketch he'd ever thrown away, because none of them looked enough like his daughter to hurt the way remembering should hurt. He didn't move. Burano moved around him. The busker found his 5th note and abandoned it. Somewhere, a bell counted the hour like it was pulling rope through history. The girl shifted the cone to her other hand, and that's when he saw it. A small bracelet, silver, a charm shaped like a crescent, hand-hammered so the light stumbled over it. A twin. The twin. He felt the world tilt just a few degrees, but enough that everything slid. 9 years of missing posters that got rained on. 9 years of well-meaning people who'd say, sometimes not knowing is a kind of mercy, and meant it. 9 years of private investigators who were better at sending invoices than calling with news. 9 years of putting on suits and giving speeches and endowing scholarships because doing good was a way to outshout grief. The charm flashed. The girl disappeared into the crowd. It took him a second to realize he'd started walking fast, then faster. People stepped aside. Someone swore. A child laughed and pointed, because there was something funny about a man in a linen jacket, sprinting like a bad dream, was right behind him. He lost her at the corner, where Via San Mauro kisses the canal and then doubles back like it forgot its keys. He stopped, dragged a breath of salt and heat, and did what 9 years had trained him to do. He started looking at the edges. He checked reflections in the glass of a shop window where a lace collar lay like a snowflake on velvet. He glanced up, catching the shadows moving across a balcony sagging under flower boxes. He scanned the water's surface, searching for a ripple that didn't belong. "She went that way," a voice said in Italian. A shopkeeper, the one who sold masks with eyes that followed you, nodded toward a narrow alley where the shade smelled like yesterday's rain. "The girl with the bracelet." "Oh." Matteo didn't ask how the man knew what mattered. He just said grazie and vanished into the seam of shadow. The alley opened onto a quiet square where laundry lines made the sky into music sheets. The girl was there. She'd taken a seat on a stone step, was reaching for a bottle of water in her tote. Her friend was fussing with a camera that wasn't cooperating, and for a beat, for one impossible suspended beat, he was close enough to see the small scar under her left eyebrow that he had memorized before the world was reordered by loss. He could say her name now. He could say it out loud, let it break against the walls, watch it come back to him changed by the acoustics of the life they hadn't shared. He could walk forward and ask, softly, "Do you know a song your mother used to hum when she burned the sauce because she danced instead of stirring?" He could pull a photograph from his wallet, the one so worn the corners were soft as felt, and hold it next to her face, and ask the square to do what courts had refused to, recognize. Instead, he did what grief had also trained him to do. He waited. He counted her breaths in and out until his pulse slowed. He watched the way she scanned the square, not with fear, but with that precise alertness you learn when life has taught you that exits matter. He watched her offer her friend the last of the water, watched her laugh when the cap escaped and rolled 3 stairs down, watched her tilt her face toward the stripe of sun like a sunflower, refusing to apologize for wanting warmth. "Mateo." The voice behind him was a thread pulling him back through time. Juliana or Julian, depending on who was asking and how formal the room needed to be, stopped at his shoulder. Journalist-turned-investigator. The only person who had permission to say his first name like a question and a warning both. "You see her," she said. not asked. He nodded once. Juliana didn't look yet. She'd taught herself not to trust first glances in case the world had decided to be cruel that day. What's different? The bracelet, he said. He explained. The twin charms. The night Celeste had insisted on buying them at a backstreet stall in Florence, where the shopkeeper measured love in millimeters and declined credit cards on principle. The way they'd joked about who would lose theirs first. The way the charms had lain on Alessia's pillow that last ordinary morning, like they were saying, "Choose me, choose me." Juliana listened the way only people who have paid attention for a living know how to. She kept her voice low. "You know copycats exist. You know souvenirs travel." "I know," he said. The words were a load-bearing wall. "I also know that scar under her eyebrow and the way she moves like her mother did when she thought no one was watching." So, Juliana didn't need to ask why he hadn't already crossed the square. She knew the arithmetic of trauma. Hope is expensive. You spend it carefully or you end up broke again. She slid her phone from her pocket, thumbed open the camera, then thought better of it and slipped it away. "If we spook her," she said, "we lose her." "We don't spook her," he said. "We give her choices. We make sure she has exits that lead toward us." The friend with the temperamental camera finally coaxed it back to life. The young woman stood, stretching, shoulders loosening like she'd been carrying something all day, something invisible to anyone who hadn't carried it. 2. She hooked the bracelet inside her sleeve as if she knew it meant something. She glanced around the square the way people do who have been told by life to check for the shape of danger before they put their full weight on the next step. Juliana looked now. Just a second, then away. "She does the perimeter scan," she murmured. "Not paranoia. Training. Or memory," Mateo said. They watched without staring. The girl and her friend started toward a narrow lane that would spill them onto the main canal again, where Burano pretends to be a postcard so it can sell you one. Juliana's voice was a map. "If we shadow from the right, we keep the sun behind us. No reflection in shop windows. No double take when she glances back. We're gossip in the air, not a presence." "Having the time," he almost laughed. Not because any of this was funny, but because if you didn't make room for a sound that wasn't pain, pain colonized everything. "Gossip in the air," he said. "That's the brief." They drifted, not quite following, not quite not, past a woman stringing lace like a net for catching light, past a boy kicking a ball against a wall and apologizing to the paint under his breath, past a couple arguing gently about whether to turn left or right, like there was a correct way to be lost. The canal widened and the wind picked up. The girl's hair escaped its tie again. She laughed and didn't bother capturing it. "I want to be wrong," Juliana said, surprising him. "You know that, right? For your sake. Because if you're right and she's her, then the story that fills the gap of 9 years turns into something with names and dates and men who thought children were paperwork to be filed in the wrong drawers." Mateo didn't answer. He didn't have to. Juliana's gift was saying the part you were trying to keep quiet so that it didn't corrode you from the inside. He had asked her to join him in this, not because she was ruthless, she wasn't, but because she had the rare courage to be precise. Precision is a form of mercy. It chooses truth over the anesthesia of almost. They reached a small bridge sashed with tourists. The girl paused halfway, leaned over the rail to watch a boat pass under. A family on board waved at no one and everyone. The friend took a photo, then another. Mateo edged closer, not to her, but to the vantage point that would let him see the bracelet again without making it into a test he would fail if the light changed its mind. Juliana's hand, invisible to anyone who wasn't paying attention, brushed his sleeve. Wait. 2 men had surfaced at the end of the bridge, not men you'd notice if you were busy being on vacation. Their clothes were unambitious. Their look was neutral in a studied way, like a photograph edited until it was almost transparent. One of them adjusted his collar, an old habit of someone who doesn't like the feeling of a wire against skin. The other scanned the bridge not like a lover learning a face, but like a cashier counting cash. Juliana's voice changed by half a degree, enough for him to hear it, not enough for the air to. "Burano's shape," she said, "not a conclusion, a hypothesis with a long shadow." Something inside Mateo, a muscle he'd kept coiled for almost a decade, flexed. "If they're his," he said evenly, "then we don't step on the bridge. We don't make anything louder." "Agreed," she said, "but we document." They didn't raise phones. They catalogued the scuffed shoe, The scar at the base of the thumb, the way the taller one favored his left knee, like he was recovering from an old lesson in gravity. You learn to remember like this when courts ask you to submit memory as evidence specifics that don't care if a judge has slept badly. The girl straightened from the rail. One of the men shifted just enough to make room, the way men who have practiced not being in the way do. The gesture would have read as courteous if you didn't speak the dialect of control. The friend said something. The girl nodded. They moved, and so did the men, like dancers following a choreography that hadn't asked for music. "Choice," Juliana said under her breath, returning to the word that kept them honest. "We keep her choices." "How?" he asked, not because he didn't know, but because saying the steps out loud made them real. "We become background noise that's useful," she said, "a map that sees corners. If they funnel her toward the dock, we let the fruit vendor knock over his crate at the right time. If they aim for the square, we let the wedding party hijack the space. We're weather. We're coincidence. We're the thing you don't notice that nudges the story toward a better ending." Mateo nodded once. This was why he'd built foundations and scholarships and clinics in places where hope had been priced out, because sometimes the most ethical kind of power is the kind you apply so gently no one can accuse it of being force. The fruit vendor, he really did exist. They hadn't invented him, was stacking peaches into a pyramid that did not obey physics. Juliana drifted that way, her hands empty but her attention loaded. The men guided the girls off the bridge, not touching, not blocking. The tactic was softer than that. Carry the space around them and make it look like coincidence. Mateo stepped to the edge of the current and felt for it with his palm. When you're very tired, you learn to sense what the room wants to do, and whether that is safe. The room wanted to push the girls toward the dock. The men wanted that too. So he did something that seemed unconnected to anything. He looked up at the sky like he was checking for rain, then turned his face into the light and closed his eyes, and smiled, the kind of smile that makes strangers look where you're looking, as if the day had elected a surprise worth voting for. People followed his gaze. The wedding party, because of course there was a wedding party on Burano, burst onto the walkway from a side street with a cheer too big for the square. The fruit vendor flinched reflexively and knocked his peach pyramid into chaos. Someone lunged for a rolling peach like it was a tiny sun escaping. Laughter leapt. The crowd hiccuped in place. The current changed. The girls took the path of least resistance, peeling away from the dock and into the safety of a lane with too many people and not enough angle for control. The men adjusted but lost that elegant line that had made them dangerous a moment before. Juliana's chin dipped, the smallest nod of acknowledgement. Weather, coincidence, a better ending forged by physics. They didn't push luck. They let the crowd knit back together naturally. The girls disappeared around a corner that led to a cafe with a blue awning and an espresso machine old enough to have opinions. The men followed, 2 beats behind. Juliana moved, like she was just a woman thinking about gelato. Mateo became the kind of tourist who takes a sudden interest in a sardine tin display. Inside the cafe, the air smelled like burned sugar and a childhood he couldn't quite place. The girls chose a table by the window because of the light. The men took the counter, backs to the room, eyes in the glass. The barista, an older woman with arched eyebrows that said she had seen every kind of story pass through her espresso cups, clocked the spread and didn't pretend she hadn't. Juliana's voice touched his shoulder. "We don't make contact. Not yet. We let the day be normal. If she's her, she deserves one more cup of coffee that isn't a test." He looked at the girl at her wrists, at the bracelet now half hidden under the cuff, because sometimes people hide the things that matter most without meaning to. He felt the question rise. How do you act like a person in a world where every normal act has been repurposed into evidence? He didn't have a beautiful answer. He stood in line like everyone else. He ordered espresso because it made the most sense to his hands. He didn't let his eyes linger too long in the window. Through the glass, the bracelet caught a line of light and threw it back at him. His throat went tight. 9 years earlier, he had kissed a little girl on the forehead and told her he would see her after school. He had meant it with the full weight of a man who could move markets with an interview and build hospitals with a signature. He had learned, before sunset, that there are laws even gravity bows to: a distracted driver, a smashed tail light raining red, a sidewalk where time tears open. He had learned that a person can be both a father and a failure in the same sentence. Now, in a cafe where the cups had been chipped into character, he made himself a promise. It wasn't the kind of promise that tempts fate with arrogance. It was smaller, quieter, anchored in the only thing he controlled: how he would show up when the moment asked. He promised he would not turn her into a project. He promised he would not make her heal him. He promised that if this was her, if this truly was Alessia, he would let her decide the shape of their next hour, and the hour after that, and all the hours, as many as she wanted him to have. Juliana passed him a sugar packet like it was a document. "We'll peel off after this," she said. "Let them reset to a world where nothing chased them. Tonight we talk to the barista. Tomorrow we talk to the fruit vendor. We keep the circles small. We confirm what we can confirm without breaking anything we can't fix." "And if Burano's men surface again?" he asked. "We let them underestimate us," she said. "It's their most reliable habit." He smiled. First real one of the day, a tired thing with teeth. "Mercy through precision." "Mercy through precision," she echoed. They left the cafe like they had found it, gently. Outside, the wedding party had colonized the square with laughter and confetti that refused to obey brooms. The fruit vendor was telling an exaggerated story about the day the peaches mutated into billiard balls. The busker had finally committed to the fifth note and was being rewarded with coins from people who liked a man who finished what he started. On the bridge, Mateo paused. The light was tilting toward evening. The island had that temporary feeling places get when they know night will steal all the color and sell it back in the morning. He let his hand rest on the warm stone for a moment, feeling how old it was, how many hands had asked it for balance, how it was patient with all of them. He didn't look back at the cafe window. He didn't need to. He had the shape of her in his peripheral vision now, the way you carry the outline of a loved one in your body once you've memorized them deeply enough. He had a plan that didn't involve force. He had an ally who could turn weather into strategy. He had a promise he intended to keep. "Tomorrow," Juliana said, not as hope or threat, just as a date on a calendar the world couldn't rearrange. He nodded. "Tomorrow." They walked toward the vaporetto, blending into the flow, the way you do when you've decided to be patient on purpose. Behind them, somewhere on an island painted like a dream, a young woman with a crescent bracelet laughed at something small and ordinary. For the first time in 9 years, the sound didn't break him. It invited him. He used to think grief moved in straight lines like a ferry schedule you could read, memorize, conquer. Then the day rearranged itself. One moment there was Celeste with flour on her cheek and their daughter at the table drawing entire cities out of pencil lines. The next, there was a scream that didn't sound like his voice coming from his own throat, and a silence that moved in and never paid rent. It wasn't a movie disappearance. There were no mysterious letters, no riddles cast in shadow. There was a traffic tangle, a shattered tail light, a van that shouldn't have been anywhere near a school, and the chaos of 100 people trying to be helpful at the exact same time. Witnesses contradicted each other. A woman swore she saw a little girl with a purple backpack get pulled by the wrist. A man insisted he'd seen a child climb into a car willingly, laughing. The camera at the corner, the one that would have told the truth, was pointed 2 degrees too high, collecting clouds instead of faces. Celeste didn't survive the week. He still hasn't found a word that holds everything that sentence has to carry. For a long time, he moved through rooms like a man carrying a chandelier after it's been shattered. Careful, cut, still absurdly trying to keep the pieces from becoming smaller pieces. He put on suits because suits were armor, and he kept the company on course because if he could move a balance sheet, then maybe he could move time. He didn't sleep, or else he slept like a rock thrown into deep water and woke up, wondering why the surface hurt. People did what people do when a story becomes unbearable. They tried to make it manageable. They brought casseroles and statistics. They quoted faith like it was duct tape. They said the part no one should say out loud: you have to let go because sometimes the only way to survive someone else's pain is to walk them to the edge of a cliff and hope they take the jump alone. He didn't jump. He did spreadsheets on grief. He hired investigators who said the right things in the right tone and invoiced him, like hope came, with an hourly rate. He learned phrases he never wanted: non-parental abduction, custodial interference, identity laundering. He sat with police who were good at their jobs and even better at keeping compassion from leaking through professionalism. He learned there are places in the world where children become paperwork and paperwork becomes a shield. And somewhere in that first winter, when the streets salted themselves white and the city sharpened to an outline, Juliana knocked on his door. She wasn't a detective then. Not officially. She was a journalist who cared about the kind of stories that couldn't be told without hurting someone, and who hated hurting people on principle. She arrived with coffee gone cold, a notebook scuffed to honesty, and an apology on her face because she understood that asking questions is a kind of violence if you're not careful with your hands. "I can't promise you anything," she said, sitting in a chair like she was ready to leave if leaving would be a kindness. "But I can promise precision. I can promise that if there's a thread to pull, I'll pull it like it matters." He didn't say yes immediately. He had said yes to 100 versions of help and found each of them wanting in a different way. But she asked about the small things, the cadence of Celeste's laugh, the way Alessia's shoelaces were always undone, the burnt sugar smell the apartment carried after Sunday pancakes. She cared about the texture of their life in a way that made him believe she could see the holes too. So they started, not with grand gestures, but with the unglamorous work of becoming students of the ordinary. They mapped routes a 7-year-old might take without thinking, and matched them to the places where adults with bad plans like to stand. They learned the shapes of cars in the background of photos no one had noticed. They tracked receipts from kiosks that don't usually keep records and found names that belonged to nobody. They found, again and again, the absence where a face should be, the careful erasure of someone who understood how to be invisible and still get things done. Once, there was a man with a grey cap who had a way of adjusting it every time he passed a reflective surface. Juliana noticed, not because the gesture was loud, but because repetition is a language. They followed him from a park to a post office to a bus stop and found nothing but the shape of a life that didn't match a crime. Another time, there was a teacher's aide who loved children with the unguarded intensity of someone who had once been told they weren't worth loving. The rumor machine had done its damage. The woman flinched when they asked the simplest questions. They bought her tea, apologized for the audacity of their need, and left her with dignity intact. Precision, always. When the moneyed investigators ran out of verbs, Juliana did not. She learned to sit still long enough that nervous people stopped being guarded. She found a way to ask for favors without turning people into informants. She built a language with Mateo that let him be a father inside a search, without collapsing under the weight of being the father who hadn't found her yet. There were false dawns. A child in a train station 3 countries away who had Alessandro's nose and Alessia's hair and turned out to be herself, not his. A bracelet in a marketplace that made him walk so fast he forgot to breathe and then stopped him cold when the charm was a moon. Yes, but the wrong kind of crescent, the commercial kind that is made by the thousands and means nothing to anyone except the person who chose it. Through it all, he kept certain rituals. He carried a photo not because he needed to remember her face, but because ritual is a spine when the world goes soft. He read bedtime stories to an empty room sometimes, out loud, because words shape air and sometimes air needs shaping. He wrote letters to a daughter who might one day be handed a box and find a father's voice folded inside. And he worked. He built scholarships in Celeste's name, because she believed in classrooms the way some people believe in grace. He funded clinics because hope is medicine when medicine is scarce. People said beautiful things about him in public. He accepted them with the practiced smile of a man who knew that the applause was not for the thing he most wanted to be applauded for. Years are strange when you're waiting. They lengthen like shadows and then snap back to size without warning. He learned not to take anniversaries personally. He learned the sound the city makes when it's trying to be kind to a man whose daughter is a rumor. He learned that living is not betrayal, that you can laugh at a joke and still be loyal to the missing. And then a sketch surfaced. Not a photograph, a sketch. A quick study by a street artist in Burano who liked to capture the way tourists tilt their heads at color. The features were impressionistic, but the scar under the eyebrow was exact. The artist's hand, pausing just long enough to honor an accident's geometry. The woman in the sketch wore a bracelet, the kind of crescent that isn't stamped by a machine, the kind of curve a person chooses when love is the only currency that matters. Juliana slid the copy across the table between them, like a map to a new country. It might be nothing, she said, because precision never overpromises, but it's the right kind of nothing. He didn't speak for a long time, not because he was afraid to be wrong again, though he was, but because he could feel everything in him, aligning like a flock of birds that suddenly, after miles of disorder, remembers it knows how to move as one. "Burano," he said at last. Juliana nodded. "Burano." They packed light. They told no one who would turn worry into noise. They carried the kind of patience you only get after you've run out of all the other kinds. And on a bridge that looked like it had grown out of a painter's brush, he saw a young woman turn her head and tilt the day on its axis. Which is how, hours later, he found himself on the edge of a cafe window, hands around an espresso he would not remember tasting, making a promise that would govern the rest of the story. He would be careful. He would be kind. He would choose precision over hunger. He would let her choose the door and the key both. They started with the small things because small things are where people hide when they don't want to be found. Juliana returned to the cafe an hour after sunset, when the day's heat had finally loosened its grip and the locals reclaimed their island from phones on sticks. The barista with the arched eyebrows was stacking cups, humming a melody that had outlived whatever radio had taught it to her. Juliana introduced herself the way she always did when she needed something, with humility, with time. "I'm trying to remember the name of the biscotti you served earlier," she said in Italian that had learned to be polite in 2 different dialects. "My friend wants some tomorrow. My friend wants some tomorrow." The barista didn't look up from her cups. The one with almonds, the one with pistachios, or the one that pretends to be both and fails equally. Juliana smiled. The one, the 2 young women ordered. One wore a crescent bracelet. 3 mentored, and the Grahams, the reportedella say. In the Grahams, the wound, the eyebrows lifted, exactly as much as the truth could be lifted without dropping it. "Ah," the barista said, not quite committing to recognition. "They are not biscotti girls. They are, I'm pretending to be full girls. They share one canolo so the day won't accuse them of indulgence." Juliana laid a €10 note on the counter, like a bridge she hoped would hold. "We're not police," she said. "We're not trouble. We just want to make sure trouble isn't looking for them." A beat. The espresso machine sighed the way old things do when they are allowed to rest. "The one with the bracelet pays in cash," the barista said at last, still stacking, as if casual were a kind of witness protection. "Always exact. Exact people have practiced being exact. Her friend pays with a card. The terminal hates her. Everyone knows the terminal is a jealous little god that refuses to bless love and coffee in the same hour." "Do you know their names?" Juliana asked. "Only the names the receipt thinks are true," the barista said. "The friend is Ariana. Sometimes Ari. The one with the bracelet, I hear the friend say Livia. But friends call each other anything. I refuse to die for a guess." Juliana nodded, grateful for a witness who refused to be lazy. She left a second note, because gratitude counts best in the language the world understands on a Tuesday. "If anyone asks," she said, "we were arguing about which almond is superior." "None of them?" the barista said. "Pistachio has an argument, but I'm prepared to be wrong." Outside, the square had reset to velvet. Mateo waited under the awning of a lace shop, where the mannequin in the window wore a collar that had taken some grandmother an entire winter to finish. Juliana relayed what she'd learned in the shorthand they'd built. Card, cash, names. The barista's refusal to elevate rumor. "Ariana," Mateo repeated, not because the name mattered, but because saying names is a way to make room for people at the table. "And Livia, if it's a chosen name, it might still be pointing at something." "Or it's a shield," Juliana said. "Shields can point too. You just need the light at the right angle." They went to find the sketch artist. He worked near a footbridge between colors so bright they felt like they'd been painted by a child who had just learned that having choices is a privilege you're allowed to enjoy. His hands were stained the way good hands are. He recognized the sketch when Juliana slid it out of an envelope, then smiled like an old conspirator when she showed him the crescent in the strokework. "You liked the scar," Juliana said. "It liked me first," he replied. "It insisted on being seen. Some details do." He had the date, because artists who don't remember days quickly starve. He had a second version of the sketch, looser, done after the girls walked away. He even had a little ledger with notes like, "Crescent girl returns, buys water, laughs at pigeons, friend curses at camera." Both kind. You don't build court cases out of such ledgers, you build direction. "Do they live here?" Mateo asked, as if here were a city and not a handful of streets that correct you gently when you pretend they're larger than they are. "They pass through," the artist said. "Not tourists, people who have arrived and aren't finished deciding what arrived means." Which is how they found the fruit vendor again and learned he was, in fact, the island's unofficial historian. He knew the rhythm of the girls' visits. Late afternoon, Every second or third day, never on Sundays, which told you something about employment, never with anyone new, which told you something about trust. He had seen the men on the bridge before, the kind who make room with their bodies, without asking permission with their mouths, and he didn't like it. He too had a ledger. Older men on islands run on ledgers. They also run on loyalty. Do you ever sell to them? Juliana asked. To the friend, he said. She chooses fruit like a person who was once told she chose wrong. The other one bracelet girl likes to count the change for me when I'm not looking. She pretends she's keeping score. She is keeping me from being robbed by my own optimism. They didn't press. People will give you a whole life if you let silence be the next question. In that silence, the vendor remembered something useful. The friend showed me a photo once, he said. A cat with a torn ear. She called him Duca. Duke, he translated, in case they were tourists pretending to be honest. She said the landlord doesn't like him in the stairwell, but the landlord is allergic to dissent. Landlord, Juliana said, quietly marking the word. Landlord meant address if you were patient enough to translate. They followed the cat. Not literally, but cats leave trails, bowls on stoops, annoyed notes taped to mailboxes, the kind of pet hair constellation on a doormat that even a gentle broom can't fully erase. It took 2 alleys and a wrong turn to find a blue door that had been repainted so often it had texture. The doorbell labels were handwritten. One said, Moretti 3 degrees. Another said, Consetta 2 degrees. Non suonare se avete vendite. Do not ring if you're selling things, which was an assault on capitalism Mateo respected. None said Romano, which hurt and didn't help. Both. They didn't ring. Not tonight. Pattern first. Contact later. Juliana photographed the mailboxes, not because she needed the names, but because you take the photo while you have the nerve. There are always more feelings than chances. Moretti was a name that could be real, or could be borrowed the way some people borrow coats for the winter and never return them. The stairwell admitted the purr of something small being fed. Duca had a schedule, and that schedule round-tripped through a kitchen upstairs that probably had a window box with basil in it. They stepped back into the lane, which smelled like fried anchovies and clean linen, and the kind of life you can't buy because you have to grow it by hand. Juliana called a friend in the municipal office in Venice, someone she had once saved from a story that would have taken a small mistake and turned it into a permanent stain. Favors like that are even heavier than ledgers. She asked, without names, about rental rolls, about permits, about where a landlord might stash paperwork if he wanted the world to think a tenant existed who didn't. While they waited, Mateo followed a different thread. On islands, workers ferry off at dawn and return at dusk. If the girls weren't tourists, they had a rhythm. A Vaporetto card leaves a footprint, even when it pretends not to. At the dock, he chatted with the ticket clerk about how paper tickets get lost and, my friend is always losing hers, what do people do? The clerk shrugged in the way of men who have decided stress will not live in their bodies rent-free. If she has a monthly, we replace it, he said. We see names. We forget them, unless we like the person. Do you like Livia? Mateo asked, like the name had just fallen out of his pocket. The clerk squinted at the sky. Livia, who will not accept a seat if an old woman is standing, he said. That one, yes. I don't know her last name because I am a good person who minds his own business. But she rides the 8:30, sometimes, to the city. Sometimes later, your friend should stop losing her tickets. It makes me worry for her. He paused, then added with dignity, I am not in love with her. I am in love with punctuality. Juliana's call returned with a breadcrumb. The Moretti lease was real, but the document trail had a fingerprint too clean to be true, perfectly aligned stamps, a notary who was real but dead 2 years before the renewal, dates that harmonized in a way human lives don't. If you stared too long, it was beautiful. That was the problem. Real paperwork has smudges. Real lives are messy in ink. Identity laundering, Juliana said softly. The term landing like a stone on a quiet table. Not sophisticated, just thorough. Someone building a life that can survive a glance but not an audit. Burano's men, Mateo asked. He didn't say, on the bridge, because naming too much in one breath can make a fear grow antlers. If it's their blueprint, she said, it's one of the easier ones, which means she, if she's ours, could have slipped through a gate built by men who wanted to be efficient more than they wanted to be careful. That's They built the next day the way you build a small boat, sturdy, quiet, with a plan for when the wind changes. Morning would be for watching the 8:30 without becoming the reason someone missed it. Midday for meeting the landlord with a question that sounded like a blessing. Afternoon for finding Ariana's card trail in places where the terminal couldn't hide behind God. Evening for returning to the cafe to let the barista know that Pistachio had won the argument. And the part that would not be rushed, the part both of them put on the table, like something fragile, was the question of proof. You cannot build a reunion on guesswork. You cannot break a life open with the crowbar of certainty either. How do we ask for DNA without turning her into evidence? Mateo said, because naming the fear is the only way to stop it from growing teeth. By asking for consent, like it's the only door, Juliana said. No coffee cups, no hair from brushes, no tricks that let us win the test and lose her trust. We don't do clever, we do honest. Honest takes longer, he said. Honest lasts longer, she corrected. They walked the island once more before sleep, learning its night face, the way shadows behave, the echo under certain arches, the stray cat roots that suggest which windows will open to a soft voice. At the bridge where he had first seen her, the water had stolen back the gold and left only the honest kind of black. Burano's colors, asleep, looked like they were resting their eyes. He stood where he would stand tomorrow if tomorrow asked the same question. He let the tide draw a small line around his shoes and erase it, and draw it again, and erase it, as if teaching him breath. Juliana yawned. If we're lucky, she said, morning will be boring. If we're lucky, he said, morning will be ordinary. They both knew ordinary is the hardest niche to enter when your life has specialized in crisis. But they had a plan. They had a name that might be true. They had a landlord who had made paperwork sing too well. They had a barista who believed in pistachio, a fruit vendor who believed in ledgers, a clerk in love with punctuality, a sketch artist who listened to scars, and a cat upstairs who would demand breakfast at the hour that made sense to the moon. It was enough for a night. They slept like people who had put the next right thing on the calendar and told the dark it was invited to try them again tomorrow. Morning made the island honest. The light didn't flatter. It told the truth. By 7:30 the lace shop awnings were up. The fishermen's jokes were already on their second lap, and Burano's cats had adjourned to rooftops to supervise the day like tiny governors. They split the work the way they always did, when the stakes were higher than their pulse would admit. Juliana went ahead to the dock to watch the 8:30 without becoming a reason anyone missed it. Mateo circled 2 blocks behind, the unremarkable trajectory of a man who pretended to be thinking about coffee when he was, in fact, thinking about time. Ariana appeared first, camera bag, the strap repaired with a careful stitch that said she'd fixed more than one thing she loved. She bought a ticket with the resigned patience of a person who had already argued with the terminal in her head and decided peace was worth more than principle. Buongiorno, she told the clerk. The clerk beamed like punctuality had sent him a valentine. Livia, if that was the name she wore today, came 2 minutes later, hair tied back, the bracelet tucked under her cuff, the way people tuck important words inside their sleeve in cold weather. She walked like she knew the schedule intimately and refused to perform hurry for anyone. When the boat pulled in, she made space for an old woman with a basket. The old woman made space for her in the kind of exchange that means you belong to a place, even if the paperwork says you don't. Juliana didn't board. Not yet. You don't follow someone into a smaller space if you want them to keep breathing easily. She watched the boat push off, watched Livia tilt her face into the wind, watched Ariana lift the repaired strap on her camera and frame a shot only she could see. When the wake settled, she texted one word to Mateo. City. They rode the next boat, then blended into Venetian morning. Venice teaches you that maps are suggestions and instincts are a public service. The girls took the wide, working route, no scenic detours, no show-off bridges toward a narrow street near a print shop that still smelled of ink, the way churches smell of candles. Ariana peeled off into a co-working space with mismatched chairs and earnest posters about collaboration. Livia kept going. Juliana ghosted 2 storefronts behind as Livia turned into a small art restoration studio. The hand-lettered sign in the window said, "We mend what time meant well." There were brushes in coffee cans and canvases, leaning like eavesdropping neighbors. A woman in her 50s looked up from a frame and greeted Livia with the kind of warmth that comes from shared quiet, not small talk. Juliana didn't need audio to translate. Livia shrugged off her jacket, folded it deliberately, tied on a canvas apron, and went to work. She moved with reverence, not performance. Soft brush, breath held on the exhale. The patience of someone who knows damage is an invitation, not a verdict. The bracelet glinted once as she reached, then disappeared again, the crescent briefly a thin moon in daylight. Mateo watched from across the car, a reflection among reflections in a pane that held a dozen little Venices at once. There was something bewilderingly ordinary about the scene that shook him more than any near miss had. This wasn't danger. This wasn't chase. It was a life, fully engaged, built from careful minutes. He stepped back before the feeling turned into pressure. He would not make a sacred space into a test. By midday they had a rhythm. Ariana's co-working space on Fondamenta, Sant'Anna, the Wi-Fi named after someone's grandmother. Livia's studio a 10-minute walk away, a tiny trattoria between them where the owner refused to serve tourists half portions because hunger makes you unkind by dinner. Juliana ate there, not because she was hungry, but because rooms tell you things when you pay for the right to listen. She learned the owner's name, Concetta. She learned that Ariana tipped in exact change, plus a silly coin, as if banishing bad luck. She learned that Livia always asked about Concetta's son, and always took, "He is fine, God willing," as the answer, because boundaries are a form of respect. At 2, the men from the bridge reappeared, less careful in a city that teaches you anonymity for free. They took stools across from the co-working space and pretended to develop a sudden passion for panini. Juliana didn't look at them with her eyes. She looked at them with her attention, same knee favoring left, same collar tweak. A third man now, shorter, the kind who smiles only with the bottom half of his face. They weren't following the girls, not exactly. They were orbiting, waiting for a predictable corridor to form between points A and B. Juliana texted, 3. Orbit. Mateo didn't reply with panic. He replied with logistics. He walked 2 blocks to a tiny photo shop where passports were borne under bad fluorescent lighting and asked for a handful of spare sleeves, the clear kind that turn paper into something that looks official. He bought a fat black marker. He visited the print shop that smelled of ink and ordered nothing, complimented everything, and left with the knowledge that the owner loved to stamp things with satisfying thunks that echoed like approval. Then he went to see the landlord. Moretti had the look of a man who had inherited obligations, not property. There are landlords who are tyrants, and landlords who are tired. He was the latter. His office was a desk that had forgotten how to be proud, a window that let in a slice of the canal's gossip, and a calendar with a boat on it that would never, in its long life, float. "I'm looking for a unit for a young researcher," Mateo said in Italian that carried the faint music of Rome and money. "Short-term, quiet, paperwork to make the municipality happy." Moretti's eyes sharpened just enough to be considered awake. "Everyone wants quiet paperwork," he said. "No one wants to pay for it." "Well, maybe for Lucian. To life. I always pay for what I want," Mateo said without threat. He placed a card on the desk. It wasn't his. It was a foundation's. The name on it, one of his directors, was the sort of name that makes municipal offices remember how to be kind. The card had a phone number that rang to a person who would tell the truth. Yes, they place fellows. Yes, they need lodging. Yes, they keep their receipts tidy. Moretti softened a millimeter, then a millimeter more when Mateo complimented the basil dying proudly on the sill. Men who keep plants alive even badly are reachable. He didn't ask for a specific address. He asked about plumbing, about light, about winter. He let the conversation move toward trust, like a boat drifting toward its moorings under a sky that had decided to cooperate. And when Moretti, out of pride more than cunning, pointed at the building with the blue door and said, "That one has good bones," if the stairwell would stop complaining, Mateo said the most useful word, "Ah." Not surprise, recognition. He left with nothing written and everything useful. The cadence of renewals, too perfect. The name of a notary that matched Juliana's call, too dead. The pattern of tenants young, careful, often cash, always kind. He could have pushed harder. He didn't. Pressure makes men choose loyalty to themselves. Respect lets them choose loyalty to what's right when no one is keeping score. Back on the street, Juliana had a line on Ariana, a freelance editor's listing with that same camera strap peeking into the corner of a profile photo, a playful caption about making broken footage honest, no last name beyond the initial, an invoice template posted in a small forum, bless creative people who crowdsource contracts. The footer hinted at a tax number that could be validated if you were the tax authority, or very convincing at pretending. Juliana was neither today. She noted it and moved on. At 4, Livia left the studio. The restoration woman hugged her in the doorway the way people hug apprentices who have become family. On the street, the men adjusted the air around them. It wasn't crude. It was space management, the art of making the path of least resistance lead past your eyes, past your questions. Choice, Juliana reminded herself. That word again. Keep her choices. She stepped into the bakery right as the door handle on Livia's side stuck a known quirk, evident from the way locals jiggled it with a practiced shove. Juliana stayed inside, held the door open with a shoulder, pretended to be very interested in a tray of bomboloni. Livia smiled a small thanks without making it a conversation. The men had to slow. Chivalry becomes cumbersome when a woman holds the door you thought you were going to hold. The current changed by a degree. Sometimes a degree is all that keeps a story from sliding the wrong way. They let the afternoon end itself. Ariana and Livia reconvened, compared notes without words the way friends do who have already used up today's words on work. They boarded the 6:15 back to Burano. Juliana and Mateo took the next one and let the day exhale. On the island, evening wrapped color around itself like a scarf. Concetta's trattoria refused to let the girls pass without a plate. The fruit vendor counted peaches and pretended not to be counting glances. The barista at the cafe pulled down the shade halfway and then pushed it back up because she didn't like the way dusk made her feel temporary. They chose their moment not to speak, but to exist in the same square with intention. Mateo sat near the wellhead, an open book in his hands that he didn't pretend to read. Juliana stood where anyone who wanted to find help with a printer would see her and intuit she was the category of person who knows about paper jams. The girls passed, safe inside the circle of a normal evening. The men from the bridge did not show. Even clocks rest sometimes, and because the night offered it, they rehearsed the part that mattered, the ask. No tricks, no clever, a simple introduction near the studio, perhaps tomorrow, framed by respect, never blocking the exit. A sentence that holds both the fact of a father and the humility of a stranger. My name is Mateo. I might be wrong, and I can live with wrong. If I am right, I will never ask you to carry my grief. I will ask your permission to learn your truth. And if you will allow it, we can use a test that belongs to you to confirm or to free us both. Juliana listened, tested it against the air, shaved a word here, softened a syllable there. She nodded. Honest, she said. Breathable. He pocketed the words like a compass, not a guarantee, a direction. Burano's bells took attendance of the hour. Somewhere overhead, Duca announced to the moon that dinner had been served on schedule. The night settled into its responsible shape, and for the first time since he had seen the charm catch light on a crooked bridge, Mateo allowed himself a small, measurable thing. He pictured saying his daughter's name out loud and hearing how the island returned it to him, altered by the acoustics of a life she had built without him and still, somehow, carrying home. They chose morning because morning is when fear hasn't had time to armor itself. Venice woke up in layers, delivery carts complaining to cobblestones, shutters yawning, coffee grinding like a promise. The art restoration studio breathed open at 8:42, exactly as yesterday had taught them it would. The woman with the careful hands flipped the sign. Livia came 3 minutes later, apron in her tote, hair loose for the walk, face composed in that particular way you learn when you need the world to see fine and not ask for a receipt. Juliana went first, not as a screen but as a gentler introduction to the idea that attention might be attached to kindness. She stepped out of the shadow of a bookshop, met Livia on the edge of the threshold where public becomes private, and made herself small on purpose. Ciao, she said, with the friendly neutrality of neighbors who share a street but not yet stories. Mi chiamo Juliana. Posso disturbarti un secondo? May I bother you a second? Livia's eyes did the quiet math of exits and probabilities, not fear, just practicality. Un secondo, she allowed, hand still on the door. Juliana didn't fill the space with words. She laid a foundation with tone. I work with families sometimes, she said. choosing a noun that wasn't a weapon. I help when papers and truth don't match. If you prefer, we can talk later, or not at all. Your choice is the first rule here. It landed. Even if Livia didn't know why yet, she understood the shape of respect when it was offered correctly. Parlor, she said. Speak. Juliana glanced to the side, a signal, not a summons. Mateo stepped forward into the light, as if he were answering attendance. No sudden movement. No performance. Just a man whose face held both courage and apology. My name is Mateo, he said in Italian that kept his Rome and dulled his wealth. This will be clumsy because there is no elegant way to say it. I might be wrong. I can live with wrong. But if I am right, then I must ask your permission to say a name out loud and ask a question only you can answer. I please yourself. Livia didn't move her hand from the door. She shifted her weight the smallest fraction, a human seismograph registering a deep tremor without panicking the city. Say it, she said. Not an invitation. A test. Alessia, he said, and it was both a word and a wound. My daughter. Silence has many shapes. This one was thin and tight and very, very clear. Inside the studio, the restoration woman looked up, registered the moment, and understood that continuing to listen was the most loving thing she could do. She didn't intrude. She didn't exit. She became furniture with a heart. Livia didn't flinch the way actors do when a script demands drama. She breathed once deliberate, long enough to find the edges of the breath and stand inside it. Then she asked the kind of question people ask when they've had to be their own detective for too long. And if I am not the word you want me to be, then I apologize to you for making a morning into work, he said. I leave you with more privacy than I took, and I pay whatever penance you name a donation to your teacher's studio, a month of rent, a vow that our paths won't cross again, unless you wish it. No. You said permission, she said, tasting the word like she didn't trust it yet. What does permission mean to you? It means no tricks, he said. No cups, no hair, no we were clever and you were a set of numbers. Only if you want, only if you choose, and if you choose no, then no is the end of the sentence and we don't add a clause. Juliana watched Livia's eyes soften by a degree. Consent recognized itself. What would you ask? Livia said. A simple mouth swab, Juliana answered, keeping the science small. We can do it in a clinic you choose, with a nurse who is yours. Samples labeled in a way that protects you. Chain of custody you can watch. Results to a lawyer you appoint, so that if this is a mistake, nothing touches you that you don't authorize. And if it's not a mistake, Livia said, quiet, as if speaking too loudly might make the floor tilt. Then we go slow, Mateo said, at your speed. We learn names for the old pains and new joys. We don't rewrite your life. We ask where, if anywhere, there is room for us in it. The restoration woman wiped her hands and came to the door with a grace that said she had raised teenagers who taught her how to stand beside without standing over. I will make tea, she announced to the air, for choices. They stepped inside not because negotiations require walls, but because shade is mercy when decisions burn. The studio smelled like varnish and oranges and work. Livia didn't sit. She kept the door open a few inches, a promise to herself that nothing would be decided by momentum. Juliana set a small folder on the table and kept it closed. Paper that says boring things, she said. Clinic options. Consent forms in Italian and English. A list of which parts of a report the law needs to see and which belong only to you. See. Livia's hand, steady from weeks of coaxing cracked pigment back into coherence, hovered over the folder, then rested. I have a friend, she said. Ari. She deserves to stand in this room for the part where names matter. 5 have a writers in the names. Of course, Mateo said. It wasn't a courtesy. It was a principle. Ariana arrived 10 minutes later, breathless and bristling, the way people come when the text says, I'm okay, but come. She took in the scene open door, tea, strangers trying to make themselves smaller, and did not perform bravery. She stood next to Livia and asked, Which part do I do? Listen to the parts I can't hear yet, Livia said. They did the unglamorous work. They called the clinic one Juliana's network liked because they had once fought a police request that overreached. They booked a slot under a neutral name. They agreed on a lawyer to hold the results, a woman Ariana had used to wrangle a predatory contract and who would cheerfully body-check anyone who came for her client's dignity. They declined to share birth dates, middle names, or any facts not required by the procedure. Magic works best when you feed it as little of yourself as possible. They made a pact out loud that no one would stalk any database in the meantime. The room nodded like an honest chorus. When the tea was gone and the folder had learned the geometry of Livia's hand, she looked at Mateo fully for the first time. Not the profile she could dismiss as coincidence. The whole of him. The lines grief had chiseled. The softness that had somehow survived. "Tell me one thing," she said. "Something that would be true whether I am your word or not." He did not reach for a story that would make himself look good. He reached for a memory that might make him bearable to a stranger. "When you were 6, he said, "your mother burned the sauce because she danced us both out of the kitchen to a song she pretended to know the words to. You climbed on my feet so you could be taller. You told me if we kept moving, nothing bad could catch us. I told you that wasn't how the world worked." He paused, and a small shame crossed his voice like a cloud. "I have been trying to be wrong ever since." Ariana blinked first. Livia did not blink at all. She stood so still it felt like she had become the room's center of gravity. The restoration woman, behind them, placed a small, well-scrubbed swab kit on the table the way some people place a candle. "Okay," Livia said at last. "We do this, but we do it on my terms. If the result says no, you disappear like a kind dream. If the result says yes, you let me decide what a first hour looks like." "Yes," Mateo said, with a relief that did not try to be relief's louder cousin. They walked together to the clinic, not as a unit, but as a temporary caravan with private reasons for taking the same road. Juliana peeled off half a block early to become air cover. Ariana told a joke bad enough to earn its keep, and Livia's mouth found the shape of a smile that didn't apologize for existing. Inside the clinic, the nurse read the room in 2 seconds flat and performed the miracle of bureaucracy done gently. Forms slid across the counter like they wanted to be signed. Swabs met cheeks with the courtesy of practiced hands. Labels gained numbers. Numbers gained envelopes. Envelopes gained signatures that meant something. The lawyer's office accepted custody with a click that sounded like a door locking from the inside to keep the weather out. "It takes time," the nurse said, with the candor of someone who has stopped lying for tips. "Not long, but not now." "We're not asking now," Juliana said. "We're asking for clean." On the sidewalk, they paused at an intersection that believed in chaos as a path to harmony. No one rushed the goodbye because rushing would have turned it into something it wasn't. Ariana squeezed Livia's hand once. Livia looked at Mateo and gave him the thing you give a person you have not forgiven and have not needed to. A nod that says, "I saw you try." "Tomorrow," she said. "Not promise, not permission, just a place to put breath." "Tomorrow," he echoed, and did not reach for a hug the moment hadn't hired. They parted. Across the fondamenta, 2 of Burano's men admired a window full of shoes with a focus that was insulting to cobblers. They had not interfered. Men like that rarely move early, but Juliana had captured them in the corners of reflections, taught her camera to love glass. She had times and angles, and the name the third one had let slip when his phone betrayed him with a too loud caller ID. Back in Burano at dusk, Conchetta slid a bowl of pasta in front of Livia on the house and pretended she did not notice new gravity in the girl's shoulders. The fruit vendor miscounted on purpose so he could argue with her about change and keep her attention on a solvable problem. The barista wiped down a perfectly clean counter because some rituals are how we make rooms brave. Mateo sat on the bridge where the world had first tilted and let the night make the colors honest again. He checked the part of himself that wanted to sprint ahead of time and told it to sit. He was a father. Today, that meant building a fence around patience and guarding the gate. Juliana joined him with 2 paper cones of fried calamari, as if repeating a shape could keep luck attentive. "We're in the window," she said. "The part of a story Burano likes to bungle. He assumes outcome. We assume process. Process usually wins." He nodded, tasted salt, let the oil scold his fingertips. "Tomorrow," he said again, trying the word on his tongue until it was less dangerous. Above them, the moon took attendance of tides and cats. Somewhere, a bracelet's thin crescent caught the last of the light and kept it a second longer than the day could explain. Morning did not arrive with trumpets. It arrived with the quiet competence of people who open shops before the sun decides to be generous. Juliana checked her phone only twice before 8. A personal best. The lawyer sent a single-line text at 8:17 formal, almost shy. Result ready. In office. Release per prior instruction. They didn't run. They walked like the ground might be fragile and they didn't want to be the reason it cracked. The lawyer's office was small and stubborn, with plants that had survived summers on principle. She greeted Ariana by name, Livia with an introduction that didn't presume familiarity, and Mateo with an eyebrow that warned him against any behavior that confused money with entitlement. "We will do this in order," she said, opening a folder like it contained fire. "First, the consent you both signed." She tapped the page. "Second, the lab certification. Third, the summary. And then, if you wish, the underlying data. I recommend no one pretend to understand it beyond what the scientist who does this for a living has said. No one tried to be the hero of a genre they didn't study." She slid 2 copies of the 1-page summary across the table, one to Livia, one to Mateo, and kept a third for the file that would not escape her custody unless wrestled. The page did not sing. It did not weep. It said, in the clipped mercy of science, what needed saying: probability consistent with a biological parent-child relationship, match strength, strong, controls passed, no anomalies detected. Livia read it once, then again, then folded it in half, like she had to make it smaller to fit it somewhere safe. She didn't look at Mateo. Not yet. She looked at the lawyer and said, "What does this obligate me to?" "Nothing," the lawyer said, like a benediction. "The paper answers one question. The next questions belong to you." Ariana breathed out the way people do when a cathedral decides not to fall. Juliana had her hands wrapped around a cup of water she didn't remember accepting. Mateo made the smallest sound, the kind that would have become a sob if given an inch. He gave it none, not because he was ashamed of crying, but because the room belonged to Livia first. Livia set the page down. She took off the bracelet slowly, like it was welded, and placed it beside the report. A crescent on white, a moon beside numbers. She looked at Mateo for the first time, as if he were not a question anymore, but a person who would require verbs. "Okay," she said softly. "We do an hour, not forever, not even an afternoon. An hour." The word tilted the world into a posture that could hold it. They made it easy on purpose. Conchetta's trattoria had a back table no one fought for before lunch. Conchetta pretended she needed to polish cutlery back there and told a teenager to mind the front with the kind of threats only a mother can make effective without volume. The first 10 minutes no one told a story. They traded nouns. Coffee, water. Bread, yes. Olive oil, please. It's how you build a bridge when you don't trust wood yet. Then Livia asked the question she'd earned the right to ask. "How did you survive me not being?" The grammar was wrong on purpose. The heart of it was right. "I didn't survive well," Mateo said. "I functioned. I did kind things loudly and sad things quietly. I learned that grief doesn't appreciate an audience, but knows when it's being ignored. I tried to be useful until useful became muscle memory, and then I couldn't tell the difference between helping and hiding." "And Celeste?" Livia said. "She did not say, Mother. She would not be asked to carry 2 reunions at once. She died with music in the air," he said. "That is the only way I let the sentence be big enough for her. There was an accident first, there were failures after. But the music, that is how I refused to let the last thing be a number." Livia nodded. "Once." Her hands had found each other and decided to hold on like old friends. Ariana watched his face the way best friends do when they are prepared to become a wall without being asked. Juliana catalogued exits without shame. Vigilance is love when done correctly. They tested smaller, bearable questions. "Do you like your work?" he asked. "Yes," Livia said. "Restoration teaches you that damage can be honored without being permanent." "Do you have a favorite place in the city?" "In last of the why love to RSRT was prively. He's like the bactive like Seb's life him, to left of a loft, a window by the Zattere where the wind scolds me into thinking straighter." "Do you want to know about?" He gestured at a decade, at a company, at headlines he wished were smaller. "Later," she said gently. "Fame is too loud for the first hour." He asked if she wanted to see photos. She said one, only one. He gave her a picture, not of a party, not of a boardroom, but of a Sunday on the floor building a lopsided tower out of blocks. A little girl, Alessia, grinned into the camera with a candor toddlers sell wholesale. Celeste's hand, out of frame, was holding the tower steady. In the corner, a crescent bracelet glinted like foreshadowing. Livia didn't cry at the photo. She smiled with an expression that made Ariana lean her forehead into her shoulder for a second. just to be there for contact. I remember the feeling of being taller than furniture, Livia said, almost to herself. That's all. A feeling. That's a lot, he said. Feelings are the address truth uses when it can't find the mailbox. They didn't try to compress 9 years into the remaining minutes. When the hour scraped against its edges, Livia checked the time like a person who refuses to let appointments bully her, but also refuses to miss a promise to herself. I have to go, she said. My work needs me to be on time. I need me to be on time. 4. Can I walk you to the corner? He asked. Not because corners are romantic, because corners are where sightlines change and people feel vulnerable. You can walk me to the door, she said, with a generosity that understood dignity as space. At the threshold, she turned. Tomorrow, she said again, but this time the word had a tiny sprout of trust in it. Same hour. Only if the day behaves. Only if the day behaves, he agreed. They let her go without escorting her with their worry. Ariana followed a beat later, a shadow that had been promoted to guardian long ago. Juliana stayed with Mateo until he remembered how to move without leaving pieces of himself on the floor. That afternoon, precision returned to the other thread, the one with men who believed orbits could hide intent. Juliana's photos were clean enough to show to a person who mattered, a magistrate who had made a small career out of refusing to be bored by paperwork crimes. She texted, then met him under the pretense of coffee and handed him a tidy package stills, timestamps, a diagram of movements, and the tidy absurdity of the Moretti lease with the dead notary's signature that had traveled through time. You're not bringing me blood, the magistrate said. You're bringing me ink. Ink that moves children, Juliana said. Ink that launders people. He did not promise raids. He promised attention. We will ask softly at first, he said. Men like that are proud of their efficiency. Pride makes leaks. Leaks arrived faster than anyone deserved. The third man, the short one with the bottom half smile, believed in a loud phone. Juliana had the number. The number belonged to a shell cleaning company that never cleaned anything except histories. The corporation registered to an address that had been a bakery 10 years ago and a rumor since. The accountant attached had been disbarred in another region for being too creative with people's lives. Burano, the magistrate said, as if diagnosing a smell. He outsources the messy work. He keeps his hands the color of money. How Haitian his binest of there. Then we stain them, Juliana said. Ink travels. They also found kindness. The barista admitted she had chased a man out once, a man who stood too close to the window when Livia sat there and smiled at his own reflection like he'd earned access. The fruit vendor confessed he'd told a nephew to change his route on days the men scouted. The nephew had complained, then obeyed. Conchetta admitted to inventing an uncle who sat by the door reading the paper whenever the girls ate alone. The uncle did not exist, but 2 retired fishermen rotated the role with pride. By evening, a small, invisible perimeter had formed, neighbors doing what neighborhoods have always done when systems lag. They decided to be the system. No uniforms, no sirens. Just attention, loyalty, and the intention to complicate bad plans without heroic speeches. Mateo let himself be folded into that perimeter without needing to lead it. He paid for fruit he didn't need. He over-tipped without insult. He learned people's names and used them like seeds. He became, in the oldest sense, a citizen, someone whose presence makes a place safer. On the bridge, night arrived in competent blue. He thought about the hour they had spent and the hour they hadn't earned yet. He thought about how science had answered a single question neatly while the rest of the questions lined up like children at a fountain, overflowing and impatient. Juliana sat beside him, set her phone face down, and said, "The magistrate wants more pages. He likes pages that gossip about each other. I'll give him pages." "Tomorrow," Mateo said, the word now becoming ritual, "we try for another hour. And if Burano twitches," Juliana asked, "then we keep doing physics," he said. "Small forces, quiet deflections." A cat announced somewhere that fish had been dropped, scooped, and partially redeemed. A bell negotiated with the dark. The crescent moon climbed the sky like it was tired, and did it anyway. And in an apartment, behind a blue door with texture, a bracelet lay on a table next to a folded paper that had redefined a life. Livia touched both once before sleep, not to worship them, but to remind herself that truth, once confirmed, should be allowed to rest like any other living thing. Juliana tapped the counter twice. The print shop owner hit his stamp with a theatrical thunk. Concetta's uncle stood, blocking the lane with a smile that said he'd been standing there since 1973. The fruit vendor sent a crate of peaches rolling like marbles. The sidewalk choreography broke, not chaos, just a different rhythm. Ariana laughed on purpose. "'Scuse it. Today the fruit wins." And Livia used the moment to step left, reclaiming the center of her own path. "Ragazze, da questa parte." Juliana called lightly from the doorway, as if she'd been asked to check a font. Livia and Ariana slipped inside. The door swung shut. The men hit glass. No scene. Just physics. The magistrate arrived in the kind of car that doesn't apologize for being legal. Two plainclothes officers eased the men to the wall with the courtesy of professionals who prefer paperwork to drama. IDs. A business card from a cleaning company that never met a mop. A phone lighting up with a name Juliana already had. One man muttered, "Avvocato." The magistrate murmured, "Con piacere," and dialed the number first. Moretti, the tired landlord, stood across the way and made a decision in public. "Ho sbagliato," he told the magistrate before anyone asked. "I was wrong." He produced copies of the notary page he'd been given. Too perfect. Wrong date. Dead signature. "I can testify," he added, surprising himself. Inside, Ariana filmed reflections, only no faces, documenting position, time, the way a neighborhood conspires toward safety. Livia set the restored frames on the counter and kept her hands busy, divided by still. Mateo hovered at the threshold like weather present, directional, never force. The officers walked the men out. No spectacle. Just a door opening and a door closing on a chapter that had thought it could stretch longer. Outside, the magistrate told Juliana, "We'll follow the ink," then said to Livia, in the tone reserved for citizens, not files, "Se hanno disturbato la tua vita, finis qui. If they disturbed your life, it ends here." Livia nodded once. "Ends here," she repeated, like testing the acoustics of relief. They didn't celebrate. They reset. Concetta declared the neighborhood closed for lunch and fed everyone who'd held a corner. Peaches triaged, bomboloni bribed into silence, coffee poured like truce. At the edge of it, Mateo caught Livia's eye. No speeches. Just, "Tomorrow if you want we try for 2 hours, now that the day remembers how to behave." Livia slipped the crescent under her sleeve, half smiled. "2," she said, and the island exhaled like it had been holding its breath for 9 years. They met where the light was honest, by the Zattere window Livia loved, wind-correcting thoughts. 2 hours became 3 without anyone noticing. They didn't rush the big nouns. They built with small verbs. He told her about the scholarship in Celeste's name. She told him about the first painting she mended right, how the crack taught her to be patient with herself. He admitted the years he'd confused philanthropy with penance. She admitted the years she'd practiced being Livia, until the name fit like a jacket she'd chosen, not a costume she'd been handed. At some point, Ariana excused herself and returned with gelato, because grief and joy both ask for sugar. Juliana texted one line. Magistrate pulled the thread. "Piano's shell is unraveling," then put her phone face down and let the afternoon be human. No grand reveal, just a steady choosing. They walked to the bridge where it began. Burano wore its colors like courage again. The fruit vendor miscounted on purpose. The barista pretended not to watch. Moretti watered basil like a confession. Mateo didn't ask for a verdict. He offered a question with room in it. "What does us look like, if there is an us?" Livia looked at the water, the houses, the sky that had learned their story, and decided not to be dramatic about it. "Slow," she said. "Dinner sometimes. Stories when I'm ready. No cameras. No headlines. You come to the studio and learn how to mend what time meant well. And when I say stop, we stop." "Deal," he said, grateful for a contract that wasn't written and bound him more than any paper. She took off the bracelet moon thin as a promise and pressed it into his palm, then shook her head and closed his fingers back around it with hers. "No," she amended, smiling. "We don't pass crescents like batons. We wear them. Both." He lifted his cuff. A twin gleamed, 2 halves of a small, stubborn moon catching the same light. Around them, a neighborhood continued its shift. Ledgers balanced, cats fed, stamps inked. The magistrate's pages whispered their way through offices where change moves slow, until suddenly it doesn't. The shell company buckled. Names found consequences. Doors that had once only opened one way remembered how to close. At dusk, they stood with the ordinary. Concetta argued that seconds were an act of mercy. Livia accepted on principle. Ariana taught Mateo how to hold a camera without making it shy. Juliana bought the barista's worst biscotti and declared it a masterpiece. The barista rolled her eyes and tucked a better one in the bag for free. When the bells counted the hour, Livia touched the crescent at her wrist and spoke like someone laying a cornerstone. "Tomorrow," she said, "not as a test, as a plan." "Tomorrow," he answered, learning the sound of a future that doesn't need to shout. They crossed the bridge slowly. The world didn't change color. It didn't need to. It had changed shape enough to hold them. And in case you were wondering, no one is left behind the gate when a whole neighborhood decides to guard the keys.